Hello, this is David Bernstein. I'm the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. I'm here with my partner in thought crime, Brandy Shafatinsky. Hello, Brandy.
Hi, David.
We are here to talk about, as always, the non-controversial issue of the recent Supreme Court ruling striking down affirmative action in higher education, specifically the court case that involved Harvard. It obviously was a big day, and there's been a tremendous amount of talk online about this. Let me just make it clear before we go into any of this that we at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values have no formal position on affirmative action. This is David Bernstein and Brandy Shafatinsky opining in our personal capacities about what we think about an issue. So I'll go on. I guess I'll go off on the beginning and then open it up to Brandy. I've always been torn about affirmative action in general and affirmative action in higher education. I would have supported early versions of affirmative action that gave descendants of slaves a leg up in higher education or anywhere else. I always have supported some kind of affirmative action based on class, and I believe the current Supreme Court decision still allows that. In other words, they're not saying you can never factor in somebody's personal circumstances or you have to stick strictly to grades and SAT scores. They're specifically saying that you can look at other factors, and they even say that someone can talk about the role that race played in their personal lives as part of their application process. So that gives them a bit of an out. That gives universities a bit of an out, which Harvard was quick to point out in their response to it. So I have to say, I think that this was the right thing for America now. I still support a version of affirmative action that looks primarily at class or maybe zip code. That's another thing. Or, where there's, disadvantaged areas, be they Black, Latino, white, whatever, that give kids from those areas a leg up, or, would allow the valedictorian of every high school, special advantage. I don't know. But I think that it was time to move away from what we had. And Brandy, I want to spend a little time and you can express your personal opinion too, if you'd like, but I want to spend a little time talking about what was wrong with the current system and why maybe there were people who otherwise might support some form of affirmative action who think that this was the right decision on the part of the Supreme Court. So what are your thoughts? Like what was wrong with the current situation?
I think to do that, it's looking at what has been the purpose of affirmative action. So when historically the purpose was to address the unfair treatment that certain people received when they were seeking admission into colleges and universities. That's how it initially started, because of race-based discrimination. It seems that in the current model, it's transformed to be something that, okay, we're using affirmative action for the purpose of diversity and diversity in its most narrow, shallow terms. So diversity of skin color. So so that we look out in our campus and it looks more diverse, color-based diversity. And if that's the case, if that's actually the case and what affirmative action has been used for in college and university admissions today, then it's outlived its usefulness, which doesn't mean that it never should have been in place. But if the purpose of it today is really just to diversify a college or university campus, or to address a past injustice that isn't still current, then it's not just outlived its usefulness, but it's not even functioning in the form that it was originally intended to function in.
Yeah. So, it creates obvious problems like the child of a Nigerian doctor getting a major advantage over, let's say, a Cambodian kid who might be first generation or second generation living in poverty. And it does, and in fact, in some ways, the Cambodian kid is disadvantaged because of his race. And one thing that the Supreme Court ruling pointed out, and I think really beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that there were specific efforts in place on the part of Harvard to discriminate against Asian American kids, that they had personality tests and other ways of ferreting out Asian kids to keep their Asian population down.
And to me, if that's the case, then they were using it for the exact opposite of its intention. They're using affirmative action to discriminate based on race. If that's the case, then the Supreme Court decision was the right one.
Right. So I think that it's time to try something different and new creative ways of making sure we give people opportunity, and that the Supreme Court was completely right in the way it looked at this. There's several articles that are sort of taking down the Supreme Court. There have been several public figures. I think AOC was one. Dan, maybe you can put up her tweet. And there's been some very good articles also that have supported it. Yes, if SCOTUS was serious about their ludicrous color blindness claims, they would have abolished the legacy admissions, aka affirmative action for the privileged. 70% of Harvard's legacy applicants are white. SCOTUS didn't touch that. Now, a couple things on that. Number one, that wasn't up for discussion before the Supreme Court. This was not a court case about legacy admissions. It was about the specific discriminatory policies of Harvard based on race, and particularly its discrimination of Asian Americans. So that wasn't even up for discussion. That's number one. And I don't think it had the basis on which to opine on legacy admissions. The second part of that, Dan, if you could put that tweet back up, because I want to dwell on it for a second, because I think the second part of it is that she says 70% of Harvard's legacy applicants are white, as if that's somehow a reason to condemn it. But 70% of American population are white. So this would mean, if that's the case, if her number is correct, that it's actually that the legacy application process is actually quite representative and would even meet equity standards, because that's basically the percentage of Americans who are white. So I don't see that as a source of criticism at all. Brandy, what do you think about all that? What do you think about legacy admissions in general?
I understand in the name of fairness, people wanting to address legacy admissions. And maybe make the argument that they're not fair and they shouldn't be allowed. I also understand that their legacy admissions don't only benefit white students. You go to any HBCU and there are legacy admissions there, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a form of tradition. Now, this is very similar to affirmative action, where it can be bad and something that needs to be addressed is when somebody gets an unfair advantage over someone else. And I don't think that AOC's tweet represents that if her numbers are correct.
Yeah. Let me just say, I think I would oppose legacy admissions. So if the Supreme Court takes this up and they vote to strike it down, just like they did affirmative action, I think I would be happy about that. I saw some studies about legacy admissions, and they show that in the elite institutions, the students who get legacy admissions have roughly the same SAT scores and grades as the other students. So they're getting a leg up. If you have 1420 SAT scores, which is very, very high out of whatever 1600, you're a legacy, you're likely to get in. And if you have 1420 SAT scores and you're a non-legacy, you have probably a good chance of not getting in. So I think that there's an advantage, but it's not that big of an advantage when you look at actually the scores and the grades and the like. And some have argued that legacy admissions actually provides more scholarship dollars for disadvantaged kids, because you have a lot of money that goes with legacy admissions. They're targeting kids whose parents are rich donors who went to that same school, and those people tend to write large checks, which gives scholarship money to other kids too. So there's that. But I still think it creates the impression of unfairness.
I think it can, but I'm looking at it from a personal standpoint, to where, okay, if I'm the first one in my family to go to, earn an undergraduate degree, and I worked really hard to do it, I want to start a legacy that maybe was previously denied to my parents or grandparents and my ancestors, I don't think that that's necessarily a negative thing that shouldn't be allowed. It comes down to the equation of, is it actually an unfair advantage? Everything in life isn't 100% completely fair. Should we try to get as close to fairness as possible? Of course. But in doing that, I don't know if there's a better system other than meritocracy, which is what a lot of the people who are disappointed in SCOTUS's decision are arguing against.
Right. The other thing about this is that, there's this sort of misnomer that it will send every minority kid outside, push them out of the university. But that's not really true. First of all, if you don't get into Harvard because your scores aren't good enough and you're a minority kid, you're going to get into other places. I mean, other schools are going to be more diversified because they're going to get a higher share of really talented students who just didn't make the cut at Harvard or Yale or whatever. And so I think that's a bit misleading. The other thing I think is that people who argue that that this is a major program that's pulling people up and giving them opportunity, I think you have to look at the facts. Only 1%, and this is in an article that Coleman Hughes wrote. Dan, if you wouldn't mind putting it up, and it'll be in the show notes too. Only 1% of African Americans make it to the universities at that level are benefiting from affirmative action. So this is not what's pulling people up. This is not what's lifting people up. There are all kinds of other ways, and just time, the time that we've had non-discrimination laws in place, and the ability of the community to adjust over long periods of time. But and as I think you pointed out, Brandy, before, I think today something like 2/3 of African Americans live in the middle class or above. I mean, we're talking about, we're pretending that there's been no economic or social progress made. That's just not true. So what do you think of all that? I know I said a bunch of different things there.
I think that there are a couple of different things to be said about this. One, if people really hold the belief that the only way that Black Americans can ever succeed at something is by getting some sort of handout, then that's an extremely bigoted stance to take. And the other part of it is, even if roughly 2/3 of Black Americans live in the middle class or above socioeconomically, that doesn't mean that the other third don't need assistance and help. And the biggest way to help somebody is to teach them how to help themselves. My argument against solely race-based affirmative action has always been, if you actually want to improve the chances of Black students accessing higher education, you're going to improve the K-12 education system. That hasn't happened. Instead, What's being asked of colleges and universities is for them to lower their bar, because everyone involved in K-12 education has been unable, unwilling to do their jobs. The best way, the fastest way, the most fair way, the most just way to have Black American kids enter higher education is to increase their ability to succeed in higher education. And that is a complete failure of our K-12 education system.
Yeah. Yesterday, there was this tweet that came out of somebody, a very progressive tweet that came off as extremely racist. Dan, if you can find it on Brandy's Facebook page or whatever, and get on Twitter too. On Twitter too, yeah. And I don't know. Do you want to try to describe the tweet?
I'll try. No, I mean, it said basically that when, because SCOTUS ruling on affirmative action, it means that there will be no Black Americans that ever see success again. It's, again, the perfect example of the bigotry of low expectations and the anti-Blackness that comes out of the left, that unfortunately doesn't get discussed and talked about a lot because it, I guess, isn't PC enough. It's ridiculous. It's an insult. It's an insult to Black Americans today and our forebears.
Yeah. A lot of people thought it was a satirical account. And so there was a huge debate going back and forth about whether it was satirical. And then the person said, let me let you know what I really mean by that, or whatever. So it wasn't satirical. The mysterious Sababa sisters, right? Harvard, Yale, and the like is about the connections you make and the networking opportunities. It's a good point, right? Like, that it's not just that they're going to go from Harvard and Yale to, let's say, Michigan and Emory because they didn't get into Harvard, Yale. There's some specific advantages that that you get when you go to a Harvard or Yale or Princeton, and that might change. What?
So for now, I mean, I have this discussion a lot that's for now, because people expect grads from those elite institutions to actually come away with an elite education, but that's being watered down. So
right, and the effects of equity in even more extreme forms, which may now come to an end in a way, would have eventually probably affected the brands of those institutions anyway. I'm not sure how long they're going to be able to maintain that social advantage, that brand, if they're going to, if there was no change in affirmative action. I think they would have eventually done themselves in a way. But and I think this goes to a larger point about why I welcome this decision. And it's sort of, we're pushing back against an ideology that has this much more purist form of equity than the early forms of affirmative action. That is, that anything that doesn't have perfect representation of all groups by their proportionate numbers in society is inherently discriminatory. That's the Ibram X. Kendi formula, right, of equity, and it's been embraced by a lot of institutions. It's been embraced by the government that that the goal is to get the exact number of people by their percentage in society. I think that's very destructive. And I think it actually papers over a lot of problems, like you said about K through 12 education, where your goal should be to fix K through 12 education so that you have that kids genuinely get to that, are lifted out of poverty or lifted into a more educated situation, not just to put a Band-Aid on them by allowing kids who haven't necessarily gone through the paces in education to get into Harvard or Princeton or whatever. So I think in some ways this is a setback for this larger project of equity. What do you think about that?
I think it's possible, but the same people who are in the admissions offices are still there, and they're going to make the decisions. I highly doubt we see a huge shift. It's not like admissions officers are all of a sudden going to be wearing Klan robes and denying admissions to every Black and non-white student coming in. So people expecting there to be this horrific, huge backlash, I highly doubt we see that. One thing we may see is that not just, to me, affirmative action race-based affirmative action addressed who is admitted into the university. It paid no attention to who was able to complete their degree, which is, again, something that doesn't get discussed in this conversation. So you let in a student, whatever race and ethnic background they come from, who's disadvantaged, into an elite university, and they actually don't have the tools to succeed in that university, in that setting, then they drop out. And that doesn't get addressed. Just like the pre-admissions, the K-12 education doesn't get addressed in the conversation. So it also leaves me with the question. It makes me wonder whether the point of all of these programs, equity programs, are actually to help people achieve whatever their goal for success is, or if it's just so people can say, yeah, great, I'm progressive, I agree with this policy that doesn't, in fact, really impact positive change.
Yeah, I think that's right. By the way, it may not be that they always drop out, but they may also change their major. And Michelle Obama actually writes about this in her autobiography about going to Princeton and wanting to be a doctor. And maybe if she had gone to a different university that wasn't so cutthroat in the STEM sciences, maybe she would have been a doctor. So I think that it can actually become a disadvantage. I also know a lot of African Americans, and Thomas Sowell writes about this too, that feel like they've been put upon by affirmative action. And this is something that we're not the only ones to talk about, but that they believe that they've made it on their own. They don't need the added boost of affirmative action, and they feel like it just follows them wherever they go. And I spoke to a young African American male over a dinner not too long ago. And he said, I didn't even prompt the question. He said, I don't like affirmative action because it makes people think that I haven't earned my place at the table. And I worked my butt off for years in high school and college, and I've excelled in everything I've done. And I don't want that to be questioned by anybody.
I understand his point with that. And again, I'm not somebody who thinks that it never should have been a policy.
Yeah.
There has been a very real harmful legacy of racial discrimination that disallowed people who were qualified to enter spaces that they should have been allowed to enter. And I understand the purpose of that. The question comes about is, have we made enough progress that now this policy no longer applies and we don't need it? And I'm not saying that we're all the way there 100%. Maybe we're not, but are we there enough? Because when it comes down to it, I think about just being a little personal here. You know, I grew up with a single mom and went to very under-resourced schools. And so when I took my SATs, I just went and took it. It's not like I took prep classes or got tutored.
Me too, by the way. Yeah.
I just went and took it. And so how I entered university and all of that, did I need affirmative action? Maybe not, because I had good grades and stuff. I was a good student. But to think that then my children, who are growing up with every academic and scholarly advantage possible, should then get a boost simply because they're Black, versus another kid who grew up more similar to how I did, but who isn't Black, doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And you know, if you go back to what you said before about the diversity question about whether universities have a compelling interest to have diversity, actually I have to say that has weighed on me in the way I think about affirmative action. Like, it would be very hard for me to say I would want my kids to go to a university where there's almost no Black kids or no Latino kids, where they're just around white kids or advantaged kids. Like, if that were the case, I think it would be a disadvantage in their education. But I'm not sure that that's actually what you're getting from all this. Like, that's why I think you need a much more robust class-based affirmative action program. I think you'll actually end up with more diversity that way, in a more rich diversity than you would by just sort of curating a group of advantaged minority kids who have parents who are already doctors and lawyers and what have you.
I think it depends on how you define diversity. Because if it's just color diversity, if that's the only goal, all right, keep color-based affirmative action. It makes sense. But I wouldn't say the same if my kids wanted to go to an HBCU where they're going to be around mostly kids that look like them, color-wise, that come from similar racial and ethnic backgrounds. I wouldn't be against that. I think that's a great thing. There are studies that also show that when girls go to all girls schools, they tend to do better academically. So I'm not like, diversity just for diversity's sake, to me, isn't ever a goal. It depends on what the result is. And I think that we have enough data and research to show that color-based diversity doesn't usually lead to anything positive. But when you have experience-based diversity, it does.
Right. So back to the Sababa sisters here. The question is, if a meritocracy is choosing correct metrics to consider what merit is. This is an interesting question. You know, a lot of people say, well, the SATs are actually quite a good measure. Like you, by the way, I grew up in a sort of a middle class environment, but I was not prepped and some of my wealthier friends were, but I was not prepped to take the SAT or ACT. I sort of went in there blind. There was no Princeton review. There was no Kaplan or whatever it is that my kids ended up, getting to help them get into college. I went in there basically, maybe I had seen a test before, and reviewed it once, but I didn't know any of those shortcuts to get a better score on your verbal or math. And as a result, I think I just did very mediocre on those tests. When I wanted to then go take my GREs later, and I realized that, you actually had to go through some kind of program of study, I think I did much better than I did on my SATs because I had practiced and I had tutoring and what have you. So I'm not sure that SATs are always such a great indicator of academic talent. And I think there's huge advantages of being from the kind of family that knows that you actually have to take courses and study like crazy to get your best possible score. What do you think about that?
But I think that they can be an indicator simply because if you have that background knowledge and what it takes to meet a certain level of academic rigor, you can carry that into university. And that's one thing that a lot of data shows already, is the students that actually do very well, even ones who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, it's because they have a mindset and a support system to meet the academic rigor. The students who do poorly don't. And that doesn't mean that they can't learn it or get it. It's just that's a distinct difference. So I think what it takes to actually study for the SAT, to prep for it, to prep for college admissions, is something that will help students then also prep for success in college once they get there.
Right. So what about the broader question of like, what do we mean by merit, and what merits somebody to get in? Like, is that what we consider merit itself problematic? Are grades really a good measure? Are the CTs a good measure? Should we broaden our view of merit? And is that what colleges are going to really do to get around this whole thing? They're just going to say, well, we're no longer going to really look at these academic qualifications. We're going to look at lived experience instead.
I mean, some of them already are, right? They're eliminating the need for any type of entrance exam. I mean, people are even trying to eliminate entrance exams into academically rigorous high schools, public high schools and charter schools. So I think we're already seeing that a little bit. Unfortunately, we're also seeing the negative result of that, which is students that enter these spaces and then really aren't prepared to succeed in them. And that's a huge problem in the Cal State University system, is that they've lowered the bar for entrance. And then the end result isn't more students of color, disadvantaged students or whatever graduating. It's actually more of them failing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so maybe it's the best we can do with merit. Maybe merit's a hard thing to measure, and not everybody's an early bloomer, right? Like there are kids, 18-year-olds who are not at their best at 18. They're at their best at 24 or 25. There's a lot of CEOs that didn't go to top colleges. They succeed in other ways. There are a lot of super innovative people. By the way, there are a lot of CEOs and very successful people who did go to top colleges. So there's not one path to salvation here. And so being part of the early bloomer club with the right parents and just maturing at a rapid rate that got you to the point where you get really good SAT scores or you got really good grades. I mean, I do think that that's hard. It's not a perfect measure, but it may be the best we can do. And I think the American system, more than a lot of other systems around the world, is actually designed to give you second and third chances. Like you can flunk out of college when you're 21 and at 26 get into a different college and have another opportunity, another bite at the apple. And a lot of other systems actually track you much more than the American system does. So I think that the American system, the long haul, is more merit-based than almost any other system in the world. And it may be that there's no perfect way of deciding who merits getting into Harvard or whatever, but I don't think that you can do much better than we have at this point.
I agree with you. And I also want to point out one thing. This whole conversation about the Supreme Court decision about affirmative action for university admissions is such a privileged and elite conversation anyway.
Yeah.
Because most people in the United States don't go to onto higher education anyway. And I think it really highlights how we're thinking about things. If people are truly interested in equity and justice, we'd be looking at and addressing the issues in the K-12 system a whole lot more.
Right. Well, yes. And so much of the conversation around race and some of the ideological trends that we talk a lot about are really about sort of an elitist perspective, right? They're not about lifting people out of poverty. In fact, almost everything that's done in the name of, let's say, diversity, equity, inclusion is not really about evening the score for people who are living in the most the most difficult conditions in society. And that's part of my critique of it, is it actually gets you away from discussing more important issues that need. How do you early childhood education? And if you're constantly just talking about the equity at the highest levels in professions, and that's your conversation, our societal conversation about race, you're not talking about early childhood education very much and what to do about it. And I worry that that's where we are now.
Yeah, it's a bit unfortunate. I mean, it's not that we shouldn't have the conversation and people shouldn't be debating the Supreme Court decision and the rest of that. But, you know, they just came out with another decision this morning about student loan forgiveness. And while somebody who carries student loans, I would love for all of them to be forgiven. The fact of the matter is it's really only relevant to a very small percentage of our population.
Exactly. All right. Well, it's 12:30. That's by our time. That's I think that's a wrap. And Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shabbat Shalom, Brandy.
Shabbat Shalom.
Take care.